And good hello to whoever decides to watch this. This is LC Lupus with a new video about some academic-y stuff. In this case, we're going to be looking at discourse theory and Michel Foucault with some sort of discussions every now and then about how it does relate to literature, but not in all that much depth necessarily. So let's first just preface this by saying that Foucault can be very, very up to interpretation, and people often disagree about certain things that Foucault wrote about, and people have different ideas about how to apply these kinds of concepts, etc., etc. So, let's first just talk about what is discourse. Now, discourse is one of those terms that has many, many different definitions based on how it is used and where it is used, and etc., etc. So, discourse can often mean things like talking to each other, the general way in which we are discussing a particular topic in society at large. Take any kind of topic. Usually when something happens in the world, there will then be discourse about it, say on social media. That's where a lot of people might have heard the term discourse as something that is, the way in which we are talking about a thing at the moment, or why we are talking about the thing at the moment, or whatever, right? Now, we are talking about discourse in, today's video, specifically with relation to Foucault. How did he see this? And it's sort of as a rule-based social structure, which is extremely general statement, but it is explicitly tied to language. Now, we, in this sort of brief series for the last few videos, have been looking at things like ideology and context. This is a context-based theory. You need to also look at the outside world. You can't just look at a text itself to understand this. And in many ways, discourse theory is kind of a response of sorts to ideology. But there are some differences between discourse and ideology. So ideology is something that is in opposition to something like the truth. So, ideology, it would be a good idea to watch the previous video about ideology if you're not sure about ideology. Now, ideology is also a very broad term, but in the terms that we have discussed it in the previous video, ideology can often be seen as a sort of a set of beliefs, thoughts, etc., that are a way of understanding the world based on sort of certain belief systems and stuff like that. Now, those are things that are actually in many ways opposed to the truth. They are ways of interpreting the world, but not actually necessarily the world as it is. But understanding the world as it is something that humans are not actually very good at doing. So ideology is our way of looking at the world. Now, ideology then posits that certain things are true and certain things are false. Every different ideology, say in terms of political ideology, if you're a conservative or a progressive, you will have different views about what is the truth, what is the way that we should be looking at the world. Discourse, on the other hand, says that all claims, regardless of whether or not they're true or false, are all part of discourse, because they're all part of sort of what makes up the whole that is discourse. Now, the next thing here is that ideology refers to something like a subject, whereas in discourse, we sort of move away from the subject. So the subject is like the individual, the person, etc. Whereas in discourse, we're looking not so much at people, but more at the way in which people talk. But discursive practices, or discursive processes, it's not just talking. Discourse is actually made up of basically, we are going to look at that, but discourse can be an extremely broad label that sort of refers to all of communication that is happening about a specific topic. So it's all of the actual statements that are being made by people, like the actual conversations. It's also made up of texts, which are actually the best way to learn about discourse of a certain period. Because, for instance, if I want to learn about what people were thinking in the 1500s, I can't look at conversations from the 1500s because everybody from that period is dead. So I am going to have to look at books and what have you that can explain these things to me, right? What were people thinking at the time? Well, I'm going to have to look at some philosophy. I'm going to have to look at political texts. I'm going to have to look at whatever fiction was being created, etc. I can't actually look at conversation because I don't have access to it. But that is the full scope of discourse, can be something like that, but we're going to look at that a bit later more. And the last of these things is that ideology must function in relation to the material reality from which it arises. So ideology is usually understood as arising out of something like economics. It sort of comes from somewhere, whereas discourse, it's sort of a complex relationship. So, the way we think and talk about a thing comes from various places, as well as also mutually reinforcing those same things. So, if we have certain, say, religious beliefs, then those beliefs come from the religion, but then the way we talk about the religion also then reinforces the religion itself. And not just the religion, but say, what we think about a religion also informs the economics of a place, and the economics then influences the religion, which influences this discourse, and sort of it's this complex web of influence and understanding that is makes it very, very difficult to really pin it down, because it's sort of, this is why understandings of things like discourse and Foucauldian ideas of things like power can sort of seem like they're just everywhere, because they kind of are, which can make it difficult you'll never be able to analyze it completely, so it makes it quite difficult to analyze something in a Foucauldian sense, in a more specified sense, because you could always say, well, there's always more that could be analyzed that is not being analyzed. So anyway, when it comes to ideology, we're basically looking at what are sort of mental states. Ideology is often tied to thoughts and ideas, opinions, that kind of thing, right? Whereas discourse is oriented around language, specifically language usage in its many, many myriad forms. So the term discourse here, it's often used very broadly, and Foucault he changed the meaning based on sort of circumstances, so he would sort of vary it up. Now these are three things that he said that are all in the study guide that are linked. That is not linked. That is mentioned below in the description. So, it could be seen as a general domain of all statements, or an individualized group of statements, or a regulated practice which accounts for a number of statements. These are often used interchangeably. Now, let's look at each of those, though. The general domain of all statements is extremely broad. So you could sort of say it is everything that is said in any way about a particular topic. Take a topic that's pop cultural in nature, so something like, the Marvel movies, right? If you take all the conversations that happen about those movies, including all of the articles that have been written, the reviews that have been written, if there's any books that have been written about, also, of course, any of the actual notes that went into its creation, the actual scripts, all of this kind of stuff, all encompasses, it's all of the statements that have been made with regard to that particular thing, everything together. Which obviously is extremely broad and can be kind of difficult to study, because you can't look at everything, but that's why often the focus will be on specific aspects, right? It'll be on certain things that you could see. You'll sort of change. You'll choose something to focus on in terms of a discourse methodology. You will look at something specific. To try and understand the more general. That's where it also gets into the idea of an individualized group of statements, and that could be more specified. So it's maybe not all the statements that have been made about something, but you could say, I'm going to look at, for instance, all of the reviews by, say, professional critics, or you could say all the reviews by non-professional critics, basically people who just, put scores into IMDb or Rotten Tomatoes. I don't know all of these sites very well, but that would be sort of a more individualized group of statements. And the last one here is a regulated practice which accounts for a number of statements. So that could also be the way in which certain statements in a discursive area are controlled in some sense. Like there you could also look at things like what are things that have actually been published, which is much more regulated as a sort of space in terms of traditional publication. Not just anything can get published if you're going from a traditional perspective. So you would only be looking at places that are more professional in nature, something like that, rather than looking at individuals. Now, it does also become difficult because discourse also involves language that is conversational in tone. So the language that, say, if you and I were to have a conversation about these Marvel movies, we could say that is also part of discourse, but the problem is it's not a recorded discourse. So we can't really prove what we did or didn't say, why we said it. It can't be analyzed because it is inherently ephemeral. Basically, we said it, and then it disappeared into the ether forever, existing in our minds, and perhaps slipping out of our minds, or becoming distorted over a period of time, in which our memories change and alter and grow weaker, and so we no longer remember the exact things that were said. So discourse can be difficult because we don't, if we want to look at the sort of a discursive period, we want to say, we want to look at how discourse existed at a certain time, it becomes difficult, right? Because it's easy for us to look at, a bunch of books that were written during a certain period of time, but we don't actually know what regular people were thinking. We can only sort of glean from what has been recorded, what they thought. And of course, when you look at certain periods of time, literacy rates were much, much lower. So there are periods of time in which we don't really know what regular people were thinking. The only people that actually got to read and write and do all that kind of stuff were people that were basically like aristocratic or, monks and stuff like that. Whereas regular peasants, people who just worked on farms, they couldn't really express their particular experiences because it just was kind of closed off to them because they couldn't write and they did not have a way of presenting this kind of information. Whereas if you look at contemporary discourse, a lot of it is actually recorded. Things like tweets, blog posts, rants on Facebook, whatever, they can all theoretically be brought together, collected and collated, and then analyzed to look at the way in which people think about something. But that is, only really something we can do nowadays because of the technology that exists, and the way in which we sort of spout our ideas into, because everything is really easy to reach now. If you have a phone and you have access to the internet, you could become a blogger. It's that easy. You just need a keyboard and thoughts, and then you could do it. And they don't even need to necessarily be good thoughts. They just have to be thoughts. So, yeah, discourse is everywhere, and now there's more of recorded instances of discourse that could be used. So anyway, let's move on to the next thing here, where I say that discourse is historical and determined by context. That is a very important thing. Discourse is not something that just sort of exists as an idea, or something that remains the same. Discourse constantly changes. New information comes about that allows us to change the way we think, and the way that we speak about things. Right now, discourse is focused specifically on language, as I said. So it's not really focused on thought. But the thing is, language informs thought, and thought informs language. They are in a relationship with one another. So understanding language can be a means of understanding thought, but it's not necessarily a causal relationship. What we say is not necessarily what we think, and also language is famously a kind of weak means of communicating. Language is filled with the biases of a specific language. Different languages express things in different ways. And also, of course, there will often be words that don't exist to express the kinds of ideas that we're feeling, or words can be up for massive interpretation. What do you mean by right and wrong versus what do I mean by right and wrong? Those become, we both know what right and wrong mean, but we both have different ideas about what it means. And those things can also change over history and based on individual context, which makes it quite irritating. Now, I also say here, different discursive practices throughout history have yielded different general discourses. So basically, they constantly change. So the discursive practice is, the way in which discourse is practiced, and we have done so in different ways throughout time, which influences the way that discourse in general exists, right? And I also say this is why his objects of discourse, or Foucault's idea of the objects of discourse, or what he studied, were some things that were very interesting in how they changed over time and based on context. So he analyzed things like madness, discipline, and sexuality. Now, he uses the term madness rather than something like, say, mental health or something, because he looks at how our ideas of madness, quote-unquote madness, have changed, right? Where once upon a time there were certain periods and groups that would have thought that things like what we would today call mental illness was instead basically like a gift from the gods. It was something special and unique. And then it started to shift and change, where people who had so-called madness were instead ostracized from community, and then later even imprisoned because of it. Well, confined. They're not technically imprisoned. You don't imprison someone who has a mental health condition, but if you've locked them away for the rest of their lives, it is basically imprisonment, but they would say confinement, and it's sort of separating them from the rest of society, and then that started to become not a good thing until the present day. Now we have our more mental health-oriented model, which is different to how it was before. And then in terms of things like discipline, that he looked up, sort of discipline and punishment, once upon a time it was completely fine to, gruesomely murder someone who had, like, stolen something. Today, we often don't want to just kill someone because they stole a loaf of bread. We want to instead punish them in some other way. So if someone performs a crime, what you do is then you imprison them or something like that. And even when it comes to something that he talks about, I remember, is that even death has to be non-painful in the present day. So we want our executions to be humane, where we don't want it to be painful. Like, we want to do lethal injection and pretend that it doesn't hurt at all. Whereas, back in the day, they would do things like ripping someone's, like, body apart with horses. Like, it was a very difficult and different time for discipline, and that's the idea of discipline changed, often through language, which then informed how it changed in practice. So, that is what he's looking at, like the way we talk and think about a specific thing, such as madness, discipline, sexuality, whatever. How do we actually talk about these things, and how does that talking about things change the material reality, and then how does that material reality change when we talk about blah, blah, blah. It sort of goes back and forth, which does make it quite irritating at times, but it also makes it an interesting thing to talk about. Alright, the next thing here I said is a general period of time in which a certain set of discursive formations was dominant is known as an episteme. So the episteme is like, if you refer to something as an episteme, that is a period of time in which certain forms of discourse were dominant. Now, he talks about the classical, Renaissance, and modern epistemes, which, that's just because those are sort of periods that we have recorded history of. I personally think there's far too few epistemes in this sense, and it's a very Eurocentric perspective, which I think he did also note. That this is a very Eurocentric way of laying it out, or sort of saying people in classical times thought in a certain way versus Renaissance times versus modern times. I would have much more, like many, many more epistemes, but that is a way of looking at it. And during a particular episteme, it's comprised of different statements that form the whole of the episteme, right? So the episteme is not just a thing that exists. An episteme is made up of all of the general discourse that exists within that period of time. Right, so all the things that are being produced and written and etc., those are all things that make up the episteme. It's not like the episteme just exists. The episteme has to be produced through language and the way that we justify these kinds of ideas that are present within a specific episteme. And also when those objects of discourse that I spoke about, things like madness and discipline, the way in which we treat those things has changed over time. And each of those changes could be seen as its episteme. So it's sort of an epistemic period of time in which these certain ideas have shifted and changed. And also, that is why, I say here, there are ruptures rather than a linear progression from one historical period to the next. That was a major thing Foucault looked at. In sort of more standard ideas of history, history is traced kind of as a straight line. Right? We started as primitive peoples, and then we became more and more civilized. It's seen as a straight line, rather than something that's constantly bumping and changing, right? Like, so let's just say, let's do more recent history. Would you say that going forward means becoming more democratic? If continuously going forward means we're becoming more and more democratic, then wouldn't you say that our history, right, it was not linear? Because during the 20th century, quite a number of states really liked the idea of fascism, which went against democracy and the ideas of things like that. So that was a rupture that then splintered it, which eventually did sort of not disappear. Fascism did not disappear, but the more mainstream acceptance of it, you could say, had its time and is no longer around, although there is now a resurgence in the 21st century, so that is very fun. But that is, it's not just linear. There was a break where we thought, we're going to get more and more and more, good and democratic and whatever, and then, no, let's have a little bit of a fascism here for a while, and then it sort of ruptures the progression of history, and then it will continue thereafter. So it's not necessarily linear, but rather something that can break and move and shift. It's not as clear-cut as standard history would generally want you to believe, or at least that is sort of the idea here, that it's not, that discourse is something that can shift and change. It's not something that's purely linear, like we might want it to be purely linear, but it's not. So when we want to determine these kinds of changes in discourse, we engage, according to basically Foucault's methodology, archaeology and then genealogy. So archaeology is kind of the methodology of discourse analysis, tracing how to analyze discourse over time, and then genealogy allows us to sort of see the to actually basically be the aim, like what is the discourse doing. So you can see archaeology as examining discourse itself, right? So it's looking at actual discourse, people speaking about things, writing about things, blah, 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 blah. Whereas genealogy is sort of tracing the interrelation of discourse and power, how these things relate to each other. So it's not just discourse, it's not just, different statements that are being examined. So books and, books and popular media and conversations and etc. It's not those that are being examined, it is that is the examination in terms of archaeology, but we want to use those things to understand a certain period, often in terms of power, and power is a very major concept in Foucauldian everything. So a major thing in understanding discourse is ideas of things like knowledge and power. So power is something that is everywhere. Power is... people do have power, but power is something that exists between people rather than necessarily being something that is only held in the hands of the few, right? We all have power in different amounts and in different ways. Power that we can exert over others and power that can be exerted over us exists in those kinds of different ways of looking at it, and that also means that power is extremely pervasive. It is everywhere. It surrounds us, basically. And knowledge, you can sort of see as our way of, and they are often related to each other, but knowledge is a way of also instituting power, but knowledge is very, very broad as well. And you could see that as, what do we understand as being knowledge, as being truth? Those are the kind of things that can become very difficult to examine, because discourse does also, because remember at the beginning of this we sort of said that ideology is something that is often defined in opposition to the truth. And discourse is sort of saying, no, that all claims, true and false, all form part of discourse, but that becomes then what does knowledge become? Knowledge becomes a combination of true and false statements that all come together for an understanding of the world, which is, yeah. The last thing I say here is how does discourse relate to literature? Now, actually, before I get to that, let me just say, this is an extremely general overview. There are a lot of things that I left out, a lot of things, because going into Foucauldian discourse theory stuff is very complicated, and you could pretty much have a long video on each concept and how they all relate. He was quite prolific. He wrote a lot of stuff, and he also did a whole bunch of lectures that also became very, very important things. You can kind of see them all as being part of sort of discourse theory in general. It becomes a very, very broad topic. So I would recommend a lot of sort of other people, especially say someone like Theory and Philosophy. Now I'm hoping I'm remembering that correctly. I should put like a link. But that YouTube channel is extremely good at basically analyzing an entire text, discussing basically, he would take something like one of the books that Foucault wrote, and then go through it chapter by chapter, discussing it. I think I will, if I can remember, to put a link in the description for this one. But I'm actually going to quickly, while I'm recording this, just sort of slowly speak so that I give myself time to look at YouTube and see if I can see theory and philosophy. But yeah, his stuff is really, really good. I think I will put a description there. I am not seeing anything lately. Come on, people. But yes, his stuff is very, very good, and he will go into that in much, much more depth than I generally do, because I go into it more from, also mine is often from a more literary perspective, which is what I'm going to get into a little bit now, in brief, not in particular detail, just because it's not... The thing about Discourse is that Discourse is very interesting. I use Discourse. Okay, it's called Theory and Philosophy. Okay, cool. I was correct. I will put a link to his stuff below because it's very, very good. But I look at more so literature rather than just these things in pure isolation. Generally, I do also look at them. Like this video is much more about the philosophy of discourse rather than, its relation to literature. But if you want to learn a lot more about Foucault, because not all of it was related to literature, you can look at other people who will go in much, much more depth than I will. I may have used Foucauldian discourse theory in my master's degree, but it is complicated stuff, and I will not do it justice because I just have not analyzed it as widely as others, and there's also often debate. So it's good to look at other people's ideas and interpretations of Foucault's work to sort of see how you would then interpret it. Now, lastly, let's talk about this final question. How does discourse relate to literature? Well, literature is part of discourse, right? If remember that discourse is, the general domain of all statements, well, literature is part of those statements. Literature allows us to understand how people were thinking at certain periods of time. If you look at certain periods and then you were like, okay, well, why did they do this? Why did they look at it this way? That can only really be understood by looking at sort of texts from that period. Why did people feel that witches were real and that they had to be burned at the stake? Why do people believe that? Well, we probably need to look at a bunch of texts, literature of various varieties, not... we could also be looking at non-fiction things, but we could also be looking at any kind of fiction sources that might try to claim that there are certain things going on. Also, if we were to look at very simple things like, what if, for instance, we decided to want to try and understand why do we believe in the economic system that exists at the moment? Why do we believe in capitalism, etc.? We can find lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of pieces of literature that are very, very happy with things like capitalism and things that are very, very angry with things like capitalism. So you will get fiction, right? Like books, movies, music that valorize and critique capitalism, all of which forms part of discourse in general. Because remember, it's both true and false claims. So it doesn't actually matter if something is true or not. What matters is that it is part of the discourse. So any novels, any short stories, any movies, any of these kind of things, which could all be termed literature in a very, very broad sense, all form part of discourse in general. So if you want to understand discourse of something, you can look at a text, right? And you read a text, say a book, and you'll say, well, why does it sort of talk about the things it talk about? Why does it act as if certain things are true and certain things are not true? What is the motive behind this particular text? Why is it doing the things that it is doing? That all forms part of discourse. So if you want to analyze literature from a discursive perspective, you would say, how does this fit into basically all other forms of discourse about whatever it happens to be, right? So that is why it's an extremely broad concept. And if you want to analyze it, you would often use other theories that will help you to actually do the analysis, whereas discourse you can use to help analyze further than just that. say, a fictional world in which there are certain, I don't know, let's say you could take something like Avatar, The Last Airbender, right? That's quite a famous thing. I think a lot of people know that. You could analyze that from sort of a discursive perspective, because you could say, well, there's different periods of time, isn't there? There's the period from before the last Avatar, died, in which the world was sort of kept in a more of a state of balance. And then there was the big war with the Fire Nation versus everyone else, which you could see as sort of another epistemic period, right? You could say, well, during that period, things were very, very different and understood in a very, very different way. And then you could see the sort of post-war period with, like, Legend of Korra, which is then very, very different. Each of these periods becomes a completely different thing, and can be understood in different ways. And you could analyze why are people the way they are in that period, and why do they talk the way they do, why do they use language, and why do they have thoughts the way they have thoughts. So all of those things become part of the whole. That is a very, very brief understanding, though I'm not going into like a lot of depth. As I said, there's other people who are much, much more comprehensive than I will ever be about discourse theory. So yes, that is it. If you enjoyed this and you want to support the channel, whatever, you can always check out one of my books. My sort of the main one that I'm focusing on at the moment is Fleshstone Blues, because Fleshstone Blues is my little baby that released at the end of 2023. And Fleshstone Blues is a cyberpunk dystopian, horrible, everything terrible novel about a world in which we have figured out a way to transfer our consciousness into a body, into whatever body we want. So we can put it into a little chip, and we can be like, okay, I feel like being this person today or this person tomorrow. We can sort of interchange it out. So in this world, no one can actually die. And the entire story revolves around someone who got killed. So, how did he die? Why did he die? Could be an interesting thing if you are interested in such things. Other than that, like, comment, subscribe, share the video, that kind of stuff. If you have any questions about this topic or other topics, literary topics preferably, I don't really know anything about physics, you can put in the comments, and if I know the kind of concept, maybe I'll respond, or I will make a video going over that concept. There's, all sorts of things that could be done. So yeah, that is it for now. I hope that everybody has a great day, week, and month ahead. And that is it. Goodbye.